Terrific.
Just
So
don't move.
we are so lucky today to have these two executives from Lionsgate, who both have really deep, rich backgrounds in entertainment and media. I think a great way to get to know the executive is to talk a little bit about their path. And so, Mana, you have a great background in Facebook, and I'd like to hear, or it'd be great for people to hear a bit more about sort of where you were before and how your path kind of infused your work at Lionsgate.
Yeah, absolutely. So I initially started my career in tech, specifically at Google, even more specifically at Google Japan. So I was working in Tokyo as my kind of first job right out of college, and my focus there was specifically around DEI and building up a pipeline of diversity in the engineering department. So in Japan, which is a very homogenous country, that means encouraging and building a pipeline for female engineers. And then from there, I moved on to Hulu Japan, Hulu US, then to Facebook, where I was a part of the consumer marketing team. And at Facebook was when I started to really kind of integrate and marry the two areas of DEI and marketing as a whole. And so that was where kind of my career really started to kick off in terms of really thinking through the space of inclusive marketing and how do we infuse that inclusive thinking throughout our business strategies, not just from a workforce perspective, but from how we create our marketing strategies and our briefs and how we market to our consumers. So from there, then I ended up at Lionsgate in entertainment. So I kind of did a industry hop, but that was also because the colleague that I built out the inclusive marketing with at Facebook, her name's Kamala Avala Salmon. She was actually going to be one of the speakers today, but COVID happened. So, but she and I, moved over together to Lionsgate because we really saw an opportunity to really think about authentic representation, not just through marketing campaigns, but also up on the big screen in movies and theatrical. So that is what brought us over to Lionsgate and working in the theatrical space there.
Excellent. And Deb, what about yourself?
Hi, y'all. My journey is a little tricky, I guess. I landed in New York at HBO doing the international traveling experience for a little show called Game of Thrones, and I actually had no idea what it was. Yes, I had someone at a coffee shop tap me and be like, "Are you Googling Game of Thrones?" I was like, "Yes, I have an interview, and I need to know what this is about." And so he was like, "Take that away, I will tell you what it's about." So I got the job, and that was a temp job. And found myself just like without a job 4 months later. Across the hall, there was a multicultural marketing team that was being built up by Lucinda Martinez, who's a tremendous force, a Latina in this industry that I admire. And so I started there as a coordinator, worked my way up, focusing on the Black audiences. And I worked a few years there, and then I was tapped by Facebook to come and join their creative shop team in the entertainment vertical, and I was actually going around different studios pitching them how to best utilize the Facebook ad platform. And so just pitching different creative ideas, and I was looking around the room and I kept seeing a void. There weren't people that looked like me. And if there were one or two. And I really started to value the seat I had at the table at HBO, and so I went back to HBO and worked my way up until director, and I helped launch a few audience initiatives there. Most notably, the Palante initiative. I also helped a few marketing campaigns for Watchmen, Lovecraft Country, I May Destroy You, small shows. And just tremendous experience that I built there. And I was scrolling on Deadline and saw that Kamala had this role, and she is actually someone that I looked up to at Facebook, and she brought me. So she is the glue, and this says Kamala, so I'm here to replace her. Sorry you can't meet her, but she's great. You will, eventually.
She says hello.
Yes.
So one of the things that we really want to do is talk a little bit about tactics and kind of move away from like esoteric thinking to, there's so much said about multicultural and about inclusive marketing. What are some of the tactics and tools that you're using in the course of your work? So if you want to start.
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to take a very quick step back because this is a really good question. I get this question very often of what is inclusive marketing? Actually, I'm going to take an even bigger step back. As a team, the inclusive content team at Lionsgate, we cover 3 business areas. There's inclusive creative, inclusive marketing, and inclusive business. Debbie's going to talk a little bit about the inclusive creative side, where she works with the development team. The marketing side is we work hand in hand with our entire marketing team to think through and make sure that we're centralizing inclusivity at the center of all of our strategies. And inclusive business, the third area, that's a very research-driven arm. What we do is we partner with industry organizations like USC Annenberg Institute, UCLA Center for Scholars and Storytellers, and we do just a lot of research to kind of analyze standard processes that, right now everybody thinks it's like, oh, it's normal. We all go through the green light process in the theatrical space. But really examining those standard level processes and really illuminating the potential biases that are coming up in that process and then building up actionable solutions against them. One kind of current study that we're also looking at is pipeline building. So, we're examining industry-wide, like how long does it take to get from being a first-time director to a first-time feature, and then from your first-time feature to your secondary feature, and how does that pathway, your career pathway, differ across race and gender? So that's kind of another example of a study that we want to be able to share broadly across the industry. But I'll pass it off to Deb to just talk a little bit about inclusive creative, and then I'll talk about the marketing piece in more in depth.
Yeah, sorry, we ping-ponging this
Just
question.
wanted to give some context.
Yes, because inclusive content is not obviously a team that exists everywhere. We're 18 months old. We're babies at the company. We sit under the motion picture group, and I, along with Kamala and Tayana on our team, support the creative strategy aspect. So it's a deep partnership with our development, creative execs, and our acquisitions team to just ensure that the slate is reflective of the global audiences we serve. We know that audiences, marketers, that audiences are changing. We also know that there's billions of dollars left on the table when you are not representing them in film, representing different identities and audiences in film. And so that is really what our team is rooted in. It's this idea that if you don't intentionally include, then you unintentionally exclude. And that's also why the business area is really important, to just continue to illuminate the ways we've unintentionally excluded and are also unintentionally leaving money at the table.
Awesome. So then going back to the question around what is inclusive marketing. So, I get this question often of, what is it? How is it different from traditional marketing? How is it different from multicultural marketing? Does it replace multicultural marketing? Is it another discipline within marketing? So kind of just to level set, this is a visual that I talked about with my colleague actually recently, which is imagine a table, and there's the tabletop, and then there's a bunch of legs that are supporting the tabletop and holding it up, right? The tabletop is inclusive marketing, and the legs that are holding up the tabletop are those things like digital marketing, media, publicity, creative, strategy, research. All of that is the legs that are holding up this overarching umbrella of inclusive marketing. And as Deb had mentioned, it's about intentional inclusion and building systems of accountability to make sure that we are thinking about these growing, nuanced, diverse audiences at the center of our strategies. I think that when it comes to the way that we think about traditional marketing, to me, it's a little too binary, because there is the quote unquote general market, which I don't like to use that word. I think we're all trying to kind of step away from that word, because it is, if you really think about it, it's quite exclusionary, and we're not thinking about the nuances of the audiences. And then there is the multicultural market where, where we do the more tactical kind of targeted marketing strategies for a specific group when the product, or in our case, the film is deemed culturally resonant for the movie. But the problem with that is that, nothing in this world is binary, and I personally don't agree with the approach of seeing them as two separate things. We know that the diverse audience is indeed our audience today, and so we need to make sure that we're thinking intentionally about those diverse and nuanced audiences at the center of all of our marketing strategies, so that it's really permeating throughout every single output that comes out in our campaigns. So that's kind of high level how I think about kind of inclusive marketing. My experience kind of differs in terms of how it plays out depending on what company you're at, or what industry, or what product you're working on. So for me, when I first initially started at Facebook, and I was on the consumer marketing team there, one thing that we noticed was, if you look at the huge user base across all of the family of apps, the biggest, the usage drivers were truly diverse and nuanced audiences. But then if you looked at some of our campaigns, we saw there was a very clear opportunity to make sure that all of our campaigns were authentically representing those users who were, on our platforms, and were actually really, amazing users who were using our platforms to advocate for more diversity, equity, and inclusion. So with that kind of in mind, what we decided to do was we built a pretty robust program within the consumer marketing team called the IRL program, which is the Inclusion and Representation Lens Panel. And so what we did was we built out a team of 50 diverse marketers across, race, gender, LGBTQIA, disability, military status, religion, and we built several kind of smaller groups that were assigned to each of our apps, and they reviewed every single marketing campaign, consumer-facing marketing campaign that went out the door through a truly inclusive lens. So we built out this system because like we always talk about, the intentionality of thinking about inclusion at the forefront of our work was just something that people weren't really used to doing at that time. So we built this system in place, and we were able to then make sure that we were catching things before they were going out, help, and really kind of pushing our marketers to think through, how do we increase authentic representation across all of our campaigns. Also thinking about cultural relevance, and all of that. So that was kind of how it happened in the tech space. Now that we're in the entertainment space, it's a little bit different because, from a marketing perspective, the cast is already set, right? You already have the folks who are in the movie, have the talent that's already, the leads of the movie. So from our marketing perspective, I can't really influence who we're going to be putting in our campaigns because we already have those folks. But there's a lot of there's an additional kind of thinking that I'm trying to put into place about how can we make sure that the inclusive creative efforts that Deb and Kamala are really thinking through on the development side are being translated and reflected in our marketing strategies. And I can talk a little bit about that further down the line. But sorry, that was a long answer.
I really like the idea that if you're not consciously and proactively including, then you are proactively excluding. I think that's really, really well put. What are some of the tactics that you use and that you're thinking about as you think about having representation in your films and the film slate and in working with brands and brand partners with that? How do you sort of tackle that? Deb, do you want to start?
Yeah, when it comes to the films, we have built some bespoke tools that we use to measure inclusivity. If you can't measure it, you can't track it, and you know how that goes. And so we have created a thing called the Comprehensive Score on Inclusion. We're not going to give away all of it, but it does measure creative team diversity. There is data to show that if there is a more representation behind the scenes, that affects then stereotypes and tropes that are harmful to different communities. We also talk about and measure stereotypes and tropes in there and also provide solutions. We think about the idea of gate opening. If there's a first-time female Black director that's attached to this, that's huge. And so we kind of add that as part of the scoring guide. We look at intersectionality. It's not also just about representing one type of identity. It's also looking across the intersectionalities, the race, the gender, the disability, the LGBTQIA identities. So that is the CSI that we call. And I also run our diverse content review board, and that's made up of about 7 employees across Lionsgate that have nothing to do with the greenlight process, and also look very different than those folks who have the privilege to be in those rooms to greenlight those films. And they get to have a say because they inherently look at like the audiences that we serve. They're also really close to the work, and so we have a bit of a framework for reviewing that too. And what I really love about that too is that sometimes in these rooms, we don't talk about cultural relevance and how a film and how some of these themes might land with certain cultural conversations. We also know that films take a long time to be made. And so a conversation that's happening now, how is that going to evolve in a few years? And if you don't have the right folks who are experiencing who are in their living daily life experiencing some of these different identities, then you'll never know how those conversations will go. So those are 2 of our frameworks.
That's awesome that you have another separate sort of board and entity that reviews outside of the film approval. Very cool.
Yes, and it's been incredibly impactful.
Mona, anything to add from your end on that?
Yeah, I would say, I love how Deb mentioned the piece about, the groundbreaking piece. How are we being gate openers? I think as an industry, as an entertainment industry, we are known to be the gatekeepers. But as an inclusive content team at Lionsgate, what we're always trying to keep in mind is how can we be gate openers? And some of the tools that Deb had mentioned, I think, are really great in the sense that it really helps us to start just having these conversations internally, whereas I think before, even just talking about it wasn't really happening within a lot of the walls. So I think that these tools like the CSI and the board that Deb is leading internally are really great kind of tools to make sure that we're not only kind of helping our teams think through how to take creative action, but also make sure that we're having those meaningful conversations as needed.
Awesome. So in this generation, social media plays such an important role. So many conversations happening in social media. Um, how do you look at social media and being able to both represent and reflect all that's happening now and diverse audiences?
Yeah, I think that social media is as we all know, is such a powerful tool. It can absolutely play in our favor, but also you don't want to be on the other side of the spectrum where you're kind of on the receiving end of a hashtag that probably is targeting you. So, for me, I think some of like those watershed social moments, like hashtag Oscar so white, that was a huge movement that really impacted the way that Hollywood as an industry was thinking about how they're hiring, who they're hiring as directors. What does the awards process look like internally at each of these studios? Like we are re-examining, how we think about the diversity of our films and what we're submitting for awards. And even something like was it Pepsi Gate? That was also, an example of, with Pepsi and what was her name again? Kendall Jenner
Yeah.
in her commercial. But also, it's like I think social is such an amazing way to be able to meaningfully reach diverse, and nuanced audiences. So I think a brand that does that really well is like Netflix's hashtag Strong Black Lead. I think that's a really incredible example of that, and they created, a bunch of kind of some of those sub brands within Netflix social. And so I think those are some like really amazing like best practices that we could all be kind of learning from.
And I love that you mentioned Strong Black Lead, because when I was launching some of these audience initiatives at HBO, I wasn't connected to the development pipeline, and so I thought that work, it was a little bit like taking a few steps forward to tell the development people, that there's an audience that does want this. So creating these spaces for them that, you can have relevant and resonant content to then prove as like a data point to them that their people are showing up. So what happens to the content?
Awesome. What's amazing in hearing this, even like midway through the panel, is just how much work goes on. So it's fascinating to hear about all the layers, all the levels, and all the layers of thinking. What do you think has been one of the biggest shifts in your work with the pandemic and given the pandemic? How has that impacted what you do?
Well, we joined this company during the pandemic, so it was definitely and I joined this industry mid-pandemic, so I think it was definitely I was going through the motions as everybody kind of was also kind of figuring out what to do. But I think now we're quote unquote almost on the other side of it, and I think there are two kind of main things that became very clear to us. One is about audience, and one is about content demand. From a content demand perspective, I think what comes to mind for me is the fact that, everyone was forced to sit at home, everybody was on streaming platforms, everybody was watching content. Then you saw this cultural phenomenon of things like Squid Games. You saw these international, global titles and TV series, films really kind of joining the quote unquote, this is another word I don't like to use, but it's like the mainstream. And we saw this like amazing opportunity where the US audience or any audience can really kind of demand for, they start to understand like, oh, I can watch this type of stuff. And now there's like almost, it created a reality of like API representation in entertainment was like, oh, this is like real and we can all talk about it. And I think that to me personally was like an aha moment of just like, the fact that I think the content demand, the types of demand, the content that people are going to be demanding moving forward is going to start to shift because we have more and more access to this type of global media. And I think that it's also really interesting to also look at kind of like a case study of how K-dramas are becoming so popular in India for Indian women in particular. And I think that's such an interesting kind of aspect to look at because the reason why Indian women are really loving the K-drama of it all is because there is kind of like that female gaze. It's written all by, female writers. All of the characters are very empowered women who have careers, who have jobs, and not just doting on men. And I think that is because 90% of the screenwriters' rooms, if you look at it in South Korea, are all women. And so I think that's also just an interesting signal in terms of what types of content other audiences around the world may start demanding now that they have access to this type of global content.
And when you think about the audience, I think for a lot of us marketers and probably creative folks as well, just like had to shift a little bit the way that they thought about audiences and who was actually going to be risking their lives to go into the public and go sit in a theater, who had potentially the capital, the money during, you know, a tough economic time to also do that. And what I found really interesting, especially being of this community, being a Latina just marketer as well, is that Latino audiences showed up to the theaters. So I think it also is shifting who potentially we can create films for and who is showing up. We also know that older female audiences came through. There was the Lost City, Downtown Abbey, just different examples of people we had probably had never thought about fully and deeply actually showing up and changing their consuming habits.
Cool. So the theme is women are a driving force in in audience development and films. Cool.
And don't forget
Absolutely.
the Latines.
The Latine.
So with so much focus now on hyper personalization, how do you make sure that experiences and content are really sort of represented?
Yes, totally. So I want to talk about this, the tool that I don't want to say a tool, but it's more of a strategy or a vision that we've embedded within the way that we kind of do marketing as a team. And we call it the 5 A's, because as a marketer, who doesn't love a good acronym? So the 5 A's that we kind of really make sure we're thinking through at the top of every kickoff of a campaign is 1, awareness. Making sure that we're aware of all of the inclusion opportunities and pitfalls of a movie that we're working on. You know, Deb had mentioned earlier about, you know, if there is a female director that we want to make sure we're going to be breaking out with this movie, we're making sure that we're kind of being aware of that and integrating that piece into the narrative of the marketing campaign. The second A is ambition, so really setting ambitious goals around inclusion. So I think it's really important for us, again, to just be like intentional about how we're thinking about equity and inclusion in our marketing campaigns. Who are we working with? You know, what are the goals that we're setting here? So who are we trying to reach? Really being intentional about it. So ambition is the second A. The third A is advocacy, continuing to advocate for more diverse POVs throughout the marketing campaign process. Who are the agencies that you're bringing on board to work on your creative? Who are the agencies that you're working with to put together your PR campaign? Who are the film critics that you're talking to? And are we you know, excluding any specific groups that we should be intentionally elevating? Are we, you know, advocating for disability and accessibility in all of our PR events? All of that is kind of falling under the advocacy piece. The fourth A is authenticity. How do we make sure that we're thinking about authentic representation in all of our campaigns and our creative assets? As an example, we were sitting in a creative review meeting recently where we were looking at a poster of 2 characters in a movie. It's 2 young kids. One of the kids has a walking disability. And so throughout the entire movie, this character has a crutch. There's never a point in time where he's not walking without a crutch. It's just, you know, he has polio. But it's kind of a love story between the 2 of them, and the message is around kindness. And I thought it really was interesting when I looked at the poster, and I was like, the guy doesn't have a crutch in the poster. And it's kind of like these 2 teens that are like leaning in towards each other and their love. It's very sweet, it's beautiful. But I'm like, I raised my hand, and I was like, you know, the character has a crutch in the movie, why doesn't he have it in the poster? And, you know, the immediate response was, oh, that's a barrier to audiences. And so it opened up a really kind of interesting conversation around, what do we think are barriers for some of our audiences? What are kind of our preconceived notions of what we think are biases when that are kind of barriers when they could just be unintentional biases? So authenticity is a really big piece of the marketing kind of process, and thinking about if there is, you know, underrepresented characters and talent in these stories, really making sure that they're being authentically represented throughout the entire campaign, trailers, creative assets, everything. And then the final A is accountability. So that is, again, just making sure that we are holding all of our teams accountable in terms of how we're thinking about inclusion and authentic representation across our entire marketing strategy. So those are kind of the 5 A's that we kind of approach our overall marketing work with. And then going back to your question, sorry, originally, I had to talk about the 5 A's first before I moved on. was, what was it again? It was about,
You actually answered it really well.
did I? So
Yeah.
that's basically what helps us with making sure that we're thinking about like how do we make sure that all of our messaging is culturally resonant in a space where like it is such a diverse audience that we are marketing to, and yeah,
Cool.
just knowing who that consumer is.
We are, and I know that there's like, we could talk about this probably all afternoon, and time is running tight. So I want to leave a couple of moments for the audience to ask questions of these great execs. And they've kind of given a playbook here on things to do and things to avoid. Are there questions in the audience?
I'm so curious about the cane. Did they add the cane after?
Yes, they did.
Yay!
We made sure that was like a creative, like kind of principle that we included moving forward. So that's, again, it's like having these conversations is so important because then it makes people realize, oh, that's right. Like I didn't even think about that. So now that's going to be a consistent kind of creative, principle that will always kind of apply across every social media, asset that they create as well.
Any other questions? All right, awesome. So much knowledge that you two have gained, and for such a relatively still young endeavor. And Lionsgate is always pushing the envelope. So thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Coffee time.